This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 541st episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Archetypal Character Arcs, Part 8, Introduction to the 12 Negative Archetypes. Where there is light, there is shadow. Where there is a right way to do things, there are usually several ways to do it wrong. And so it goes with archetypal character arcs. Over the last few months, we have explored 6 successive life arcs, represented by the positive change arcs of 6 primary archetypes: the maiden, the hero, the queen, the king, the crone, and the mage. Each of these positive archetypes represents a rising above the limitations of the previous archetype in the cycle. But they also inherently represent a struggle with related shadow or negative archetypes. Specifically, there are 12 negative archetypes, 2 for each positive archetype. Each positive archetype sits at the top of a triangle that is completed by a potential negative polarity between the 2 negative archetypes, one representing an aggressive version of the shadow archetype, and the other representing a passive version. In Sacred Contracts, Carolyn Mace speaks of the inherent power dynamic within this archetypal triangle. The shadow aspects of our archetypes are fed by our paradoxical relationship to power. We are as intimidated by being empowered as we are by being disempowered. This is why one of the primary challenges within any of the 6 positive archetypal arcs is that of grappling with one's conflicting desire for and fear of autonomy. Only in integrating and accepting the responsibility for this growing power is a character able to escape the beckoning shadow archetypes and instead level up into the next life arc. More or less classically, and with a big nod to both Kim Hudson's The Virgin Promise and Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette's King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, corresponding archetypes can be viewed like this. For the maiden arc, we have the passive archetype of damsel and the aggressive archetype of vixen. For the hero arc, we have the passive archetype of coward and the aggressive archetype of bully. For the queen arc, we have the passive archetype of Snow Queen and the aggressive archetype of Sorceress. For the king arc, we have the passive archetype of Puppet and the aggressive archetype of Tyrant. For the crone arc, we have the passive archetype of Hermit and the aggressive archetype of Witch. For the mage arc, we have the passive archetype of Miser and the aggressive archetype of Sorcerer. Just as the temptation and struggle against the shadow archetype's corruption is inherent within all of the archetypal positive change arcs, so too are the 2 negative archetypes inherent within each other. Although a character representing a negative archetype will usually manifest most obviously as one or the other, passive or aggressive, they are really just 2 sides of the same coin. For example, inherent within any coward, there is usually a latent bully, just as the bully is often a coward at heart. There are many ways negative archetypes can arc. They can arc from negative to positive, which of course would be a positive change arc, or they can arc from positive to negative, which would be a corruption arc. They can arc from passive to aggressive, which would be a fall arc, and they can arc from aggressive to passive, which is not exclusive to, but can be seen in a disillusionment arc. Or they can arc not at all, which would be a negative flat arc, in which the character is less likely to be the protagonist and more likely to be the antagonist in someone else's positive change arc, or a negative impact character in someone else's negative change arc. The passive archetypes represent a fatal immaturity. No matter at what stage characters find themselves within the life arcs, their first challenge will be to resist their own sense of complacency and safety, which would keep them where they're at. But in fact, they have little choice about whether or not they will be called into the journey of a subsequent archetype. They can only decide whether they will grow or whether they will resist. The passive shadow archetypes are the result of a refusal to grow into the next arc, and instead trying to maintain power in its former guise. For example, someone who has successfully completed the hero arc is now being challenged to grow into the queen arc, and they may resist the call of leadership and responsibility and hide away within the selfish passivity of the Snow Queen. Life is demanding this character change, but the character resists, cannot overcome fear, and fails to complete proper growth, ending emotionally stunted and unfit to take on the responsibilities that life has now given. In Art and Artist, Otto Rank discusses the passive archetype as the, quote, neurotic. If we compare the neurotic with the productive type, it is evident that the former suffers from an excessive check on his impulsive life. Both are distinguished fundamentally from the average type, who accepts himself as he is, by their tendency to exercise their volition in reshaping themselves. There is, however, this difference, that the neurotic, in this voluntary remaking of his ego, does not get beyond the destructive preliminary work, and is therefore unable to detach the whole creative process from his own person and transfer it to an ideological abstraction. The productive artist also begins with the recreation of himself, which results in the ideologically constructed ego. But in his case, this ego is then in a position to shift the creative willpower from his own person to ideological representations of that person, and thus render it objective. It must be admitted that this process is in a measure limited to within the individual himself, and that not only in its constructive, but also in its destructive aspects. This explains why hardly any productive work gets through without morbid crises of a neurotic nature. In short, facing the passive archetype is one of the earliest steps in any positive archetype's forward struggle. This fearful shadow aspect of oneself represents what we often hear spoken of within the hero's journey as the hero's refusal of the call to adventure. Put simply, he's scared. And considering the immensity of the journey before him, we all commiserate with exactly why that should be. But if the hero, or any other positive archetype, should succumb to this fearful part of himself, he will abort not just the journey, but his own ability to grow and mature. He will get stuck as the coward, and his own progression forward in life will become immeasurably more difficult. By contrast, the aggressive polarity of the negative archetypes represents not so much the fear of reality, but the desire to control it. Although the aggressive archetypes are literally the polar opposite of the passive archetypes, the passive archetypes are still often at the root of a character's aggression. In many ways, the aggressive archetypes represent an overcompensation in response to the character's inner fear of change and growth. In The Heroine's Journey, Maureen Murdoch quotes Edward Whitman. Whether creative possibilities or regressive destruction shall prevail depends not upon the nature of the archetype or myth, but upon the attitude and degree of consciousness. Even though the aggressive archetypes appear much more proactive and productive than do the passive archetypes, they too represent a stagnation. They may be getting things done within their realm of activity, but they are not moving forward. For example, a crone who has refused to take her journey into the mage may get stuck in the aggressive polarity of the witch, using the not inconsiderable power she has gleaned throughout her long life to control others and manipulate outcomes. She looks powerful, but unlike the crone, the witch is not expanding. She represents not just a stillness within the character's maturation, but a stagnation. She has gotten stuck through her own passivity and fear, has refused, however unconsciously, to continue growing, and has instead turned her energy outwards upon a world she resents. Now, as we've already discussed, the 6 archetypal positive change arcs represent the character's ability to transition away from a limiting life belief and into an acceptance of an inherent archetypal truth. These same archetypal lies and truths are also inherent within the related negative shadow archetypes. The difference, of course, is that these negative archetypes resist the truth. Through fear of change or desire for control, they cling to a broken version of reality. Depending on the specific type of negative change arc they are undergoing, disillusionment, corruption, or fall, they will encounter various opportunities to acknowledge and accept the truth. In a legitimate negative change arc, they will fail to do so, and the metaphorical kingdom will always suffer as a result. Within all types of archetypal stories, whether they feature protagonists with positive or negative arcs, we always have the opportunity for a full cast. Just as the negative polarities are inherently present to some degree within the struggling protagonist of a positive change arc, so too is the positive archetype within the struggles of a protagonist in a negative change arc. More than that, though, we have the opportunity to externalize these struggles into the supporting cast. We can see this clearly, and have already touched on it in earlier posts, in the fact that the hero's journey prominently features more advanced archetypal characters in supporting roles, most notably the king and the mage or mentor. Likewise, negative archetypes frequently show up in villain roles. I haven't observed a hard and fast pattern, but it resonates that one of the most powerful uses of negative archetypes within a positive archetype story is that of presenting the protagonist with a version, usually aggressive, of the subsequent archetype. For example, a queen almost always has to confront and overcome a tyrant, which is the aggressive version of the subsequent arc of king. Not only does this approach provide opportunities for a solid plot theme connection, it also offers the always brilliant opportunity to symbolically represent the antagonist as a shadow version of the protagonist's potential self. As such, the antagonist can offer both temptation to the growing protagonist of the power she might wield, as well as a caution of what kind of monster she might turn into should she succumb to that temptation. Same goes for the characters in a negative change arc story. If the protagonist is representing a negative archetype, such as the sorceress, then the rest of the cast can be used to represent supporting archetypes that deepen the thematic and symbolic narrative. So, as you can already see, and as is always the case with negative character arcs, there are many possible variations that can arise when a character falls away from the health of the positive archetypes and into the unhealth of the negative archetypes. This means there are many possible narratives for representing them in the protagonist of a negative change arc. As such, I won't be offering a mythic beat sheet for each of the negative archetypes in the same way I have done for the positive archetypes. But over the course of the next 6 posts, we will be diving a little more deeply into the partnership of each passive-aggressive polarity and talking about how you can recreate these important archetypes within your own stories. So stay tuned. Next week, we will study the shadow archetypes of the maiden, the damsel, and the vixen. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the site and tell me your opinion. Are you more drawn to writing about positive or negative arcs? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make Helping Writers Become Authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thanks so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.